Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you the news that relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Well, Russia starts to pull out of Syria, North Korea firing off more missiles, the Vatican Bank setting its own rules, and a 6-year-old boy shot at a birthday party are just a few of the stories that we have for you today. But first, let's talk about those super addictive painkillers called opioids. Well, the CDC is urging doctors to stop overprescribing opioids, which are a group of painkillers including Vicodin and Oxycontin. Now, this is due to a growing epidemic of addictions, which is causing, and get this, Katan, over 40 people a day to die from overdosing on these type of drugs.
Well, that's amazing. Well, the CDC says the addiction to opioids has grown out of control over the last couple of decades, largely as a result of overprescribing by doctors here in this case. And this addiction to painkillers can turn people into heroin addicts. In fact, Jeff, the CDC reports on its website that those who are addicted to opioid painkillers are 40 times more likely to actually be addicted to heroin.
Wow. Well, the CDC is saying enough is enough and are calling for doctors to lead in reversing this epidemic. Now, they recommended doctors to try alternatives before turning to opioids, including things like exercise, physical therapy, and medications that are a lot less strong, like ibuprofen.
Yeah, it seems like that would be a little more beneficial. Well, one more precaution the CDC hopes clinicians will take is to actually check an online database to see if their patients have been going to other doctors to get the same drugs.
Well, from poisoning by pills to poisoning by water, we turn to another story of epidemic proportions. The EPA reports that over the course of 4 years, the drinking water in 431 American schools was found to contain unsafe levels of lead.
That's right, in Newark, New Jersey, concerned parents began taking their children for lead testing after elevated lead levels were found in 30 of its schools this year. The school district there also revealed the 12% of water samples taken between 2012 and 2015 were also above the federal limit of 15 parts per billion.
Well, school administrators blame the problem on old infrastructure in the school buildings. In Newark, for example, there are 67 schools which have an average age of 82 years old. A lot of parents thought school was the safest place for their children. Now they are in disbelief.
And a lot of this is coming to surface, obviously, because they're just now getting into some of the testing of the water in the schools. So, interesting. Well, Donald Trump continues to make the headlines while campaigning for president. We've seen it before, but Trump protesters are steadily making more waves at Trump rallies. Recently, one protester in Dayton, Ohio, even seemingly tried to storm the stage to get at Trump himself.
Over the same weekend in Kansas City, hecklers would barely let Trump finish a sentence. In Chicago, a Trump rally was canceled by the campaign due to scuffles between Trump supporters and a large group of protesters. Now, 5 arrests were made that evening as the scuffles spilled out into the streets from the hall where the rally was going to be held.
That's right. Donald Trump not only shouted down some tormentors, but he continued to actually provoke them with words like, "Go home to mommy," and "I'd like to punch him in the face." Wow. One Trump supporter did just that as a protester was being led out of the rally. Well, Trump said he is considering paying the punchers legal fees, and while no one has been seriously injured yet, Donald Trump noticeably increased his security at the last rally in Tampa, Florida. That's kind of a little bit scary for a projected leader, possibly.
Right. Well, a Maryland police officer was accidentally shot and killed by a fellow officer while trying to stop a gunman on a shooting rampage. Three brothers, Michael, Malik, and Elijah Ford, drove to a police station in Prince George's County on a Sunday afternoon. Michael Ford got out of his vehicle and began shooting at the station. He hit three vehicles, including a passing ambulance.
Authorities believe Ford and his brothers planned for the police to gun him down because Malak and Elijah, who remained in the car, filmed the entire incident on their phone. Well, Officer Jackia Coulson, an undercover officer, drove up on the scene and fired at the shooter to distract his attention away from the station. Although his actions allowed police to take down the 22-year-old, Ford, Coulson himself was fatally shot by another officer in the crossfire.
Well, the two other brothers fled the scene but were later taken into police custody. All three brothers will be charged with second-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and the use of a handgun in connection with a felony, among other charges.
Well, that's a shame. In other police news, a group of motorcyclists contacted the police and area news media claiming that a Fort Worth police officer sprayed them with pepper spray as they drove by on Interstate 20. The officer was getting out of his vehicle during a traffic stop. The cyclists have video proof to back up their claim.
An investigation was initiated after Fort Worth police received a video taken by one of the riders in the group. The video was also posted online. Fort Worth police say they want to talk to witnesses or anyone who might have information so they can try to determine if there is anything else not seen on the camera that could have caused the officer to want to use force against the motorcyclist.
Sure, like there's got to be a reason why he did that. Well, a birthday party for 6-year-old Nishan Moore ended abruptly when he was shot in the chest at point-blank range. Nishan's grandmother, Anita Harrington, said he just heard a pow, pow. And then she said he felt his chest and looked up and he'd seen the blood. And then he said he just started crying. Well, family members are trying to understand why a gunman would open fire on a boy riding his bike.
The specifics of what happened are unknown. The boy told police he just remembers a man shooting him. At first, police suspected Nishan had been shot with a BB gun. It wasn't until Nishan arrived at the Gwinnett Medical Center that doctors discovered the boy had been shot with a .22 caliber weapon. Now, neighbors' sentiment is slightly different than that of the mother's plea, saying, "We hope y'all get him before we get him." Ain't that what they said?
Wow, interesting. Well, according to the International Energy Agency, hundreds of thousands of overproduced oil barrels went missing in 2015. The IEA organization has calculated that out of a surplus of 1.9 million barrels, 770,000 are in onshore storage, while 300,000 are in transit on the sea and through pipelines. So the question remains, well, where's the other 800,000 barrels of oil?
Wow, it's a lot of oil.
Got a lot of people scratching their heads.
Well, it's not clear who bought this oil or even whether these barrels of oil ever existed. Now, some believe these barrels never existed and this was just a result of lax data processing. Now, no official word has come from the IEA, but representatives think that this oil disappeared into China because it's very difficult to measure what oil goes into China. However, because China is not a member of the IEA, they're not obligated to report how much oil they're buying or even stockpiling.
Interesting. Accurate data on oil production is important because if surplus amounts were overstated, it would definitely have had an impact on the collapse of the oil price that we've been seeing.
Well, this week, the U.S. imposed new sanctions on the North Korea for its recent nuclear test. Now, North Korea's response? Launching 2 medium-range ballistic missiles. The first missile fired off the back of a truck flew about 500 miles and landed in the Sea of Japan. The second one disintegrated before it got over the water.
Missile defenses were in position in South Korea, Japan, and the Sea of Japan to shoot down North Korea's missiles if necessary. Although the missiles were never a threat, defense officials call the shots. The edgiest thing North Korea could do short of firing off a missile with a great enough range to reach the U.S., some have said.
Well, the missile launches are yet another step in the buildup of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Kim Jong-un was recently photographed with what is described as a miniaturized nuclear warhead, small enough to put on top of a missile. He also boasted that a hydrogen bomb could destroy New York City.
Interesting. The Pentagon isn't taking these threats lightly and is keeping its missile defenses on constant alert. Kim Jong-un has also ordered more underground nuclear tests, and U.S. officials say those could come at any time without any warning. Wow. So we need to be alert, I guess.
Well, in other nuclear news this week, Russia has everyone's attention after announcing its withdrawal from Syria. Our chief correspondent, Larry McGee, has the latest developments for us on that story, as well as news from the White House concerning ISIS. Larry?
Within the next 2 to 3 days, Russia, Syria's strongest ally, is slated to have removed most of its forces from the country. The move was officially announced by a Russian Air Force commander following President Putin's orders for a partial withdrawal. The first groups to exit were the Sukhoi 34 fighters, bomber jets, and a transport plane saddled with personnel. But Moscow is said to still be considering whether or not to leave its S-400 missile system in place for whatever reason. To commemorate the conclusion of its operation in Syria, which lasted close to 6 months, Russia recently held a military award ceremony. In speaking as to what might be behind its latest move, President Putin says he wants to give peace a try, but also stated that Russia could redeploy on Syrian soil in a matter of hours. Language concerning the mercenaries of Syria is also continuing to escalate, with Secretary of State John Kerry recently labeling the behavior of ISIS in Iraq and Syria as genocidal. The secretary accused the mercenaries of genocide and ethnic cleansing in areas held under its control against the Yazidis, Christians, and Shia Muslims, and he is also calling for the destruction of the insurgents by force or other means. Washington is said to be working with its partners to affect the finances of the group and to try and hinder and curb its recruitment activities. The U.S. is also calling for an independent international investigation and criminal charges against those involved in ISIS activities. And Washington is said to be ready to support such measures by the International Criminal Court. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan Jeff, back to you.
Well, that's quite interesting. I guess we'll see how this situation progresses. The UN Special Envoy in Syria is calling for elections in the next 18 months. Talks in Geneva are being held soon, lasting no longer than 10 days, and these negotiations will start the countdown to parliamentary elections under UN observations. The Geneva talks will focus on forming a new government, a new constitution, in addition to organizing elections. Well, the Syrian opposition said that it will attend the peace talks, and the High Negotiations Committee, or the HNC, said its delegation will focus on creating what it calls transitional governance body with full executive powers. So we'll see how that takes place.
Well, the HNC insists on the removal of President Bashar al-Assad. Previous attempts at talks in Geneva were halted in February due to differences.
Well, Kelly Ayyad and a group of Republican U.S. senators are backing a proposal for stricter sanctions on Iran because of its ballistic missile program. Republicans say that President Barack Obama has failed to punish Iran for its missile test. Well, Tehran says there's no negotiations for its missile program, and it's excluded from the deal signed with the P5+1 group of countries. Tehran reiterates that its missile program is solely for defensive purposes and not aimed at any particular country.
We previously brought you a report on senior Israeli politician Isaac Herzog, who's calling for the removal of Palestinians from Jerusalem, saying that Israel will lose its city if Palestinian populations are not separated, as he calls for the disintegration of Al-Quds, the shortened Arabic name for actually the city of Jerusalem. Right. Now, he called for a plan to build a massive fence to separate Israeli and Palestinian neighborhoods and called for the evacuation of Palestinian families in the city and the West Bank.
Now, the Palestinians say Tel Aviv's aggressive actions, including the demolition of homes and the expansion of settlements, are a part of their plans to drive the Palestinians out of the occupied territory and Judaize the entire West Bank.
Well, in a recent interview with RT, Gerald Posner, author of God's Bankers, History of Money and Power at the Vatican, spoke concerning the world's richest bank, saying that at its true nature, it's an offshore bank operating in the middle of a foreign capital. He continued, it was created in the middle of World War II by the Vatican, a sovereign nation, and over the past 70 years, they've operated in total secrecy until the last several years of reforms. Now, before then, no one was able to see the money or who has accounts there.
Very secretive. Well, he continued, here's a 2,000-year-old institution which relied on raising donations to support its institutions, and for a long time there were Pope kings who had their own secular empire, which was lost in the late 1800s. They didn't get their sovereignty back until the Italian dictator, which was Benito Mussolini. He, the Vatican, and the Church struck an accord in 1929. Now, in the middle of World War II, which was in the year of 1942, the Pope and others decided to form what became the Vatican Bank. And it's really formed to stay off of the radar and off of the U.S. and British intelligence. Keep their eyes out of their bank.
Well, the Vatican was able to continue doing business with Nazi Germany during the war and eventually became the primary bank for Italy's politicians, the mafia money laundering of illegal drugs, and for people dodging taxes. It only has one branch, and that's inside the Vatican City, and only answers to one person, and that's the Pope, the sole shareholder. It also has no responsibility in its charter to turn a profit, and it doesn't make loans like a traditional bank.
Interesting. Well, as mentioned, for years, they've operated in secrecy and in suspicious activities. Now that Pope Francis is in office and the Europeans are telling the Vatican Bank it's time to clean up their act because one of the problems is that they do also operate on the euro. There's actually starting to be some progress, some say. Well, the Vatican stands as an independent nation and is a permanent observer at the UN with billions upon billions upon billions of dollars in the Vatican Bank. And here's the kicker now, every one of its dioceses that are under the name of the Catholic Church, well, financially speaking, they are on their own for financial stability. And this is why dioceses go under after lawsuits or settlements are brought against them.
In fact, 11 dioceses in the U.S. had to close after they had settlements or lawsuits so large from pedophilia cases. Neighboring dioceses or the Vatican doesn't come to bail them out or won't come to bail them out when there's financial trouble in the church. In fact, when these pedophilia cases were going strong, the Vatican made sure that it was insulated from any judgments like, you can't touch us.
No, I bet. In fact, class action lawsuits were filed against the then Pope Benedict at that time, but were dismissed because of sovereign immunity, which means you cannot sue a foreign head of country in an American court. So, of course, those cases were thrown out.
So Posner says that the Vatican plays the sovereign card when it wants to and the religious card when it doesn't want to pay taxes on billions of dollars of property that it owns in New York and Rome.
Interesting. Well, in regards to the Vatican and its legal troubles due to pedophilia, as a state grand jury in Pennsylvania reports, hundreds of children were sexually assaulted by about 50 Roman Catholic priests over 4 decades, during which time bishops covered up their actions. Well, Kathleen Kane, the Pennsylvania Attorney General, said that former Altoona Johnstown Diocese Bishop James Hogan, who died in 2005, and his successor, Joseph Adamek, who retired in 2011, actually worked to cover up pedophile priest tracks.
She also said that some local law enforcement agencies avoided investigating abuse allegations. Advocates for sexual abuse victims are pushing for more time to prosecute priests involved in sexual assault of children because most of the time victims can take years to come forward. And that's where you're seeing these incidences that took place 20, 30, even 40 years earlier. That's why they want more time to continue to press charges.
Sure. Well, continuing with the work of the Catholic Church, Kathleen Kane speaks about the atrocities that we just talked about that many of the children suffered at the hands of Catholic priests. Here's what she has to say.
Over 50 priests committed horrendous acts upon hundreds of children. And hundreds of children today who are now adults are still suffering those consequences. Today is the day that we tell you that this started 40 years ago. This abuse lasted for 4 decades. 4 decades. And not only was it covered up, not only were priests moved around, but Bishops Hogan and Ademic took actions to further endanger children as they placed their desire to avoid public scandal over the well-being of innocent children. This abuse took place at campsites, confession, an orphanage, children in foster homes. It took place at the cathedral. They lost their childhood. They were thrust into an adult world that is unimaginable. They weren't out playing baseball. They were trying to avoid priests.
We'll take a look at this next video that depicts where a lot of the sexual assaults that were just talked about in the previous article started for many of these victims.
Kindness and love will open the heart of any problem boy. That heart will melt within the warmth of the sunshine of love. I have really never found a boy who wanted to be bad.
Mal Burrows was 12 years old when he was placed at Boys Town in 1981 after his mother was murdered by his father.
This is your file from Boys Town.
Yeah.
The 15th of March 1983. It's a Boys Town hospital referral. You were sent to hospital on this occasion?
Yeah.
And it mentions stomach pains. What happened there?
I was right.
Very disturbing. Well, lastly, we close out our broadcast with the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, Pope Francis. Well, a report that was recently released from Rome Report stated that throughout the 3 years of Francis' pontificate, history shows that he does not address problems through laws, but by initiating processes involving many people. Instead of cutting straight to the problem, he faces a long-term process with symbolic gestures and creating, as a result, irreversible changes for his church.
Since he's taken office, some of the gestures that he's made is, on his first day of office, he paid for his hotel room, symbolizing that people must take responsibility for their actions and that the age of privileges was over, as well as trying to appeal to others by hugging and smiling. Again, reiterating that statement made by Rome reports that he does not solve problems with laws, but with hugs and smiles.
Interesting. Well, viewers, don't let hugs and smiles fool you into thinking that problems are being solved. In fact, putting lipstick on a pig doesn't make it pretty either. Laws that everyone can agree with, rules that don't bring harm to anyone or the environment, are only fully taught at the House of Yahweh in Abilene, Texas, and through the one sent Yeshua Hawkins. Contact the House of Yahweh today to find the solution to your problem and train to be a teacher of peace. Because, let's face it, the world has enough false hugs and smiles. It's time for real solutions. When you contact the House of Yahweh, don't forget to request your free copy of the monthly newsletter and the Prophetic Word magazine.
Well, to contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. You can visit them on any of their websites, www.yahweh.com, www.yisroelhawkins.com, or www.yahwehsbranch.com. You can also visit our newest website at www.ypnnews.com. And don't forget, any email, you can email them at info@yahweh.com. For any international calls, please call the number on your screen now. And once again, don't forget to go to www.yisroelsays.com and check out the Yisroel Says program, the best Bible study tool on the market today.
Don't go anywhere. Up next, the chosen branch authorized to bring forth the laws of peace, Yisroel Hawkins. For all of us here at YPN News, I'm Katan Alexander.
And I'm Jeffrey Hemmerman.
Thank you for watching.